Are you ready for a scary story? At 12:30 a.m. on October the 6th, 1854, on the Newcastle and Gateshead quayside, most people were in their homes, many in bed and asleep. That is until just after midnight, when a fire started at a wool factory. This small event would go on to create one of the deadliest disasters in Newcastle and Gateshead's history, and an explosion which killed and injured over 400 people and was seen and heard over 40 miles away. So huge was the explosion that it led to people thinking an earthquake had hit the northeast of England. This was the great explosion and fire of Newcastle and Gateshead. The two towns are set on each bank of the River Tyne, facing each other. The location of J. Wilson and Sons wool factory was at one of the most dense areas of the quay and one of the oldest. There had been a bridge crossing the river here since Roman times. By 1854, the towns were now linked by two bridges, built no more than 100 feet apart. One built at the site of the previous Roman bridge on quayside level, and another, the high-level bridge, which was an engineering marvel at the time, was much higher up, connecting each side of the valley with rail and road links on two levels. J. Wilson's previous wool factory on the same site had burned down with few injuries 3 years previously. The new factory, which was lit by gas, was a modern building which had made changes to the previous design to be safer, but it still produced highly flammable products. At midnight, on Friday the 6th of October, 1854, unsurprisingly, the mill was discovered to be on fire. The fire was seen to be on the upper stories of the building. Efforts were made to salvage stock from the lower floors to stop the fire spreading, but since the wool was treated with oil, this task was almost pointless. The fire spread quickly, and even with the fast arrival of the emergency services, the whole building was in flames, attracting huge crowds on both sides of the river. In less than 2 hours, the roof of the building had collapsed inwards, and the building was all but destroyed. Next to the wool factory was a large bonded warehouse, Bertram's, which was somewhere for shipping companies to store their wares while taxes and onward travel were arranged for them. The building was large, 8 floors high, and capable of holding an immense amount of goods. It was often used to store sulphur, nitrate of soda, and other combustibles. It was in part a double fireproofed structure, steel framed, and every protection against fire which was available at the time. Despite this, it was built adjoining the wool factory, and the intense heat caused by the fire caused the sulphur in the warehouse to ignite, melt, and send streams of blue flame from the windows and onto the streets below. At this point, the fire services and the now arrived military decided to concentrate their efforts on saving the warehouse. This was not easy. The burning produce in the warehouse produced poisonous gases and gave off bright blue light, which made it difficult for the firefighters to see. By 3 a.m, the entire warehouse was in flames. It's said that due to the bizarre blue glow, it looked morbidly spectacular. This led to people flooding the quayside and the bridges to watch the fire, and caused the whole area to be lit up by a now near purple-blue glow. The sulphur had now started to run in streams of what looked like lava, filling the roads around it. Nevertheless, at this point, no one considered this to be anything more than a tragic fire. By this point, spectators had occupied every spot on the bridges, boats, quayside, surrounding buildings. They were even on the roofs. The fire then spread to the wooden staith and jetties belonging to the factories and warehouses. This made the view even more spectacular, making it look like almost the river was on fire. Then something slightly odd happened. A deep rumble was heard, almost like a small earthquake was felt. This was followed by a small explosion within the fire. This didn't stop the firemen or scatter the watching crowds. More small explosions took place, but the emergency services continued to try to control the fire. Then, after a few minutes, the final explosion occurred. This was said to have been so huge it had a visible shockwave in front of it, and obliterated the steel frame building instantly, together with the buildings around it. It was seen and heard for 40 miles around. The reflection of it was seen far out in the North Sea, bouncing across the clouds in the night sky. It destroyed both sides of the quayside, vaporizing any people close to it. It lifted graves in the nearby churchyard. It sent giant parts of masonry flying through the skies, some of which landed 3/4 of a mile away. It stopped the clock on Gateshead's church at 10 minutes past 3 in the morning. Witnesses said they saw a pillar of cloud rising into the sky. And then, the masonry falling from the sky caused chaos, setting fires wherever it landed. As the sound of the explosion faded, it was filled with the sounds of people screaming. Fire was raining down on Newcastle and Gateshead, and both towns were engulfed in flames. The debris was incredible. Huge granite blocks, vast 20-foot splintered beams of wood, Burning sulphur and masonry landed all over the area. Smaller debris was found up to 6 miles away. Miners at Monk Wearmouth Colliery, which was 11 miles away in the deepest pit in the country at the time, rushed to the surface thinking they were experiencing an earthquake. People who survived the explosion were thrown off their feet and temporarily lost their hearing. Crowds watching from the high-level bridge, which gave a good view over the quay, said that when they managed to stand up and look where the warehouse had been, they only saw fire and a 40-foot crater in the ground. All the buildings and people were gone. The spectators, residents, and the fire services recovering from this explosion realised they had a new problem quickly surrounding them: out-of-control fires. Both sides of the quay were in flames. The fire moving so fast through the buildings it was impossible to stop. Much of Newcastle's side was made up of medieval wooden buildings, now partially blown apart by the explosion like kindling. Under much of this were hundreds of people screaming for help, their homes destroyed, while many were still in bed. Both sides of the river were flanked by steep hills, which the fire climbed up at a seemingly impossible speed. The surviving fire services and military, which had until this point been concentrating on the Gateshead side, were separated into 2 groups, with one being sent to the Newcastle side to at least try to contain the fires from spreading further along the quayside. Because so many of the firefighters and military had been injured and killed, more were required, but the explosion had damaged the telegraph wires, and these had to be hurriedly repaired so reinforcements could be requested. Fire engines and military groups came from Durham, Hexham, Carlisle, Morpeth, and even as far away as Berwick. Floating fire engines from South Shields and Sunderland were dispatched, as were engines from the latter town. Military detachments were sent from Tynemouth, Sunderland, Carlisle, most of which arrived by the earliest trains. This combined effort through the early course of the day appeared to be stopping the progress of the flames. By afternoon, the people fighting the fire seemed to be winning, with much of the blaze under control. That was until a stream of blazing sulphur suddenly appeared as if pouring out of the ground from the blast site. This set fire to a flour mill which had been partially destroyed by the explosion. It quickly burst into flames, and was now once again spreading the flour towards more houses and businesses. The massive new fire continued spreading until midnight, with the people fighting the fires nearly exhausted. The next building in the fire's path was the historic St. Mary's Church. At this point a decision was made. Buildings in the fire's path would need to be demolished by explosives to make a fire break. This was carried out by miners who had arrived from the surrounding pits to help fight the flames. Destroying buildings, most of which were already damaged by the great explosion, stopped the fire in its tracks and allowed the floating river fire engines to extinguish the remaining fires. The force of the explosion had left its mark in blown-off roofs, destroyed walls, broken staircases, shattered doors, making complete havoc of properties that it did not entirely destroy. The damage to both towns was extensive. Scarcely a house in the lower or middle part of Newcastle escaped. The main street going up Newcastle Centre from the quayside, Sandhill, had 9 out of 10 shop fronts blown in, and almost every street all the way up to Gray's Monument was damaged. Destruction went as far as Clayton Street in the west end of the town. On the Gateshead side, the damage was similar, with most of the buildings at the scene of the explosion reduced to dust, and the damage continuing all the way to the town centre. At least 53 people were killed, many of these all but obliterated by the initial blast, and many more being killed by the ensuing fires. Around 500 people were injured, some of these horribly, with all hospitals and doctors' offices overrun for the days after the events. The hospitals had to turn away all but the most injured people. 200 families of the poorer classes were burned out of their houses, amongst which were several orphans and widows. People were killed and survived in the most extraordinary ways. W.M. Woods, who had been so close to the fire when he was fighting it, was burned by it, was temporarily driven back by the sulphur in the air, making him sick. He stepped down into the cellar of a nearby building to try and find clean air. As he did so, the explosion happened. The explosion knocked him unconscious, and when he woke a few minutes later, he was buried in debris, his mouth and eyes and nose filled with what looked like coal dust. He was drowning. Then, suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 of the men who had been in the cellar pulled him free and saved his life. All the people he had been fighting the fire with moments before were killed. About 25 soldiers were alongside a metal fence which surrounded a graveyard near St. Mary's Church. The force of the explosion made the fence explode like a series of spears, flying out and impaling anyone around them. A family living in a house on Oakwell Gate, a street about half a mile from the warehouse, were awoken by the explosion. They leapt out of bed to see what was happening, and as they did so, a giant granite slab smashed through the roof of their house, destroying the bed that they had just got out of. Families living next door to each other had seemingly unfair fates. A family of 8 on Church Street all survived completely unhurt, while the neighbouring family were all killed. 2 children were found alive in the rubble, both sealed inside a cupboard, while the rest of their family were killed. Many people had to be identified by possessions, such as watches, keys, or fragments of clothes. The cause of the explosion. This isn't an easy one to answer. At first, rumours of gunpowder being illegally stored in the warehouse were rife, but a large reward for any whistleblowers to come forward with this information went unclaimed. Some scientists tried to prove that it was simply an unfortunate collection of chemicals that mixed together in the fire that caused the explosion. Others suggested a buildup of gases which could simply not escape the warehouse fast enough. Ultimately, no one knows for sure what caused the explosion. There was so little of the warehouse left that tests on the remains were inconclusive. Both towns got to work rebuilding the quayside, with money raised from various sources. The Queen herself stopped on her private train to have a look at the disaster while crossing the high-level bridge, and was kind enough to donate £100. Several local people donated far more than this. Within a few years, the quayside was rebuilt and back to normal, and it was as if the explosion hadn't happened. Well, almost. To this day, there are still some parts of the debris left to view near St. Mary's Church, which you can see in these photographs. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.